Chapter 4. Enter the Shovel. He stood in the bed of the giant dump truck like an actor on a movie set. Detail of his handsome face visible beneath the circle of the powerful spotlights blazing atop the high metal stalks. He wore his usual black long coat. A bright orange hard hat sat incredulously on his head, his golden hair spilling to his shoulders beneath it. His round wire-rimmed spectacles reflected the glare of the lights and made him look as if he had a slice of cucumber over his eye. He was pointing with a gloved hand and shouting at a crew of workers in orange jumpsuits. A shovel rubbled and swiveled on its base and reached into the hole. The scoop came up and swiveled back, dumping a load on the top of the dirt mound, which had risen to mountainous proportions since the afternoon. A worker scrambled up from the hole. He was covered in muck, a pickaxe slung over his shoulder. Muddy cuffs of his orange jumpsuit drooped around his ankles. At first, Jesse thought he was looking at a child dressed in a grown man's work clothes. Cautiously, he shimmied out to the end of the branch to get a closer look. He sucked in his breath. It wasn't a child. The muddy figure in the orange jumpsuit was broad and stocky. The worker used his pick to swing himself up onto the back of the dump truck. In a rolling gait, he made his way to St. George. He was an odd-looking little man with a huge head that was flat but wide on top, like an anvil. His bristly hair grew down to a point between his tiny eyes, which were deeply set on both sides of a smashed stout head. When the man flung his arm out to gesture at the hole, Jesse thought that he was wearing mittens. Then he realized the man only had 3 fingers on his hand. Jesse looked over to Daisy, who moved out to the end of the branch to get a better look. Jesse tried to catch her eye, but she looked totally absorbed by the scene. Jesse checked on the other workers. There were at least 40 swarming the site. Except for slight differences in height and weight and hair color, they all looked alike. St. George leapt down from the bed of the truck and climbed into the cab. He gunned the engine and the truck jeered forward. The little man in the back grabbed onto the side of the truck as it rumbled across the clearing. On the far side, Jesse could just barely make out the sort of lumber mill where the workers were feeding logs into the saw. Jesse felt the needles on the branches all around them begin to prick up, as the spirit inside the tree were asking, "Well, do you think you have seen enough?" "Let's get out of here," he whispered. The fir and the aspen began their way back very slowly. Then they melted in down the path. Emmy was already waiting for them at the edge of the deep woods when the trees lowered and Jesse and Daisy got to the ground. Jesse's hands were still sticky with pine sap. Daisy looked small cascade of aspen leaves out of her snarled hair. They went to Emmy. Emmy jumped up and down with excitement. Did you see? Did you see? Did you see their heads?" said Daisy with a shiver. "It's like they were made to be stacked upside down. And those icky little tiny eyes. They had snouts," said Jessie. "I have a snout," said Emmy, her enthusiasm rapidly dwindling. "What about their hands?" Daisy said, and held up their fingers to look like mittens. Jessie did the same to pretend to shake hands, with Mittens giggling. Emmy did not join. The transparent dryads emerged from the solid trunks, their trees, and floated over to join them. Lady Aspen said gently, "But beware, lest you judge any living creature best on physical appearance." "What the lady said is true," said the Douglas fir. "St. George is a fine figure of a man, And yet we know for a fact that inside he is as rotten as a tree stump in a beaver colony's rank backwater. Listen to my new friends, Emmy said crossly. It's not nice to make fun. I think the little men are pretty. Daisy wheeled on Emmy. How can you say that? They're working with St. George. That makes him as bad as he is, said Jessie. Emmy burst into tears. Daisy and Jessie exchanged looks. They went to hug her. We're sorry, Em, said Daisy. You're a little tired, I guess, said Jessie. And we're up way past our bedtime, Daisy added. Emmy nodded rapidly. I need my cozy nest of socks, she said. I think we've all seen enough for one night, said the Douglas fir, heaving a heavy pine-laden sigh. We will talk back at your house. As they made their way across the pasture toward the home, Jessie and Daisy continued to talk about the creatures. Revolting little pigmen, Daisy explained. That they are not pigmen, Lady Aspen said. They are Thodic ones. What's Thodic? Jessie asked. A race that belongs of beings in the kingdom far beneath us, Aspen said shakily. In the bowels of the earth. Jessie shook his head sadly. Unless we come up with a truly serious plan, we're doomed. It was bad enough when St. George was all we had to deal with. Now we've got those flat-headed, hairy little pig people? Don't call them that, Emmy scolded. Call them hobgoblins. Daisy pulled up short. Really, she said? The Dryads nodded. You see, said Jessie, that proves it. Everyone knows hobgoblins are bad. Everyone thinks dragons are bad too, Emmy said in a small voice. Oh, that's because they haven't met you, said Daisy. After tucking Emmy into her nest of socks, the cousins stumbled into the house and upstairs. They each fell to their beds and sank into sleep, so deep they didn't wake up until they smelled breakfast cooking downstairs. They got dressed quick and went into Jessie's room. Already dressed, Jessie was scowling at the computer screen, which refused to produce Professor Anderson's sight, even after repeated attempts. Finally, he turned from the empty screen and said one word. Hobgoblins. Daisy smiled and looked relieved. I thought maybe I dreamt it. If only, said Jessie. They went downstairs, joined Uncle Joe and Aunt Maggie at the table. As she nibbled at a crispy strip of bacon, Daisy asked her father the same question she would have asked the professor. Poppy, what's Thodic mean? Whoa, Nellie, said Uncle Joe, dropping his fork. You're poaching on my territory now. Thodic comes from an ancient Greek thon, which means earth or soil. You could say that rocks and minerals and crystals are all of the Thodic world because of where they come from the earth. But the word is usually linked with Thodic deities, which in the olden times were the gods of the underworlds, otherwise known, he said, as the dead. Jessie wagged his head woefully under his breath. I knew it. I knew those guys were bad news. Thodic, Uncle Joe chuckled. Where in Sam Hill did you guys come up with that word? Daisy shrugged. Online. You've got to watch that online stuff, said Uncle Joe. Not everything you read is true, and there are an awful lot of cranks out there. At the mention of cranks, Aunt Maggie's head shot up from her plate and her eyes narrowed. You two aren't talking to strangers online, are you? Daisy's eyes went wide. Jessie kicked her beneath the table. Never, said Daisy, her elfin ears going pink. Jessie sat up and said, Not us. After all, Professor Anderson might be strange, but he wasn't a stranger. Aunt Maggie went off to work muttering about creepy online strangers. Uncle Joe headed for the rock shop. Jessie washed the breakfast dishes and Daisy rummaged through the refrigerator for Emmy's breakfast, while they conferred about their next steps. If Professor wasn't available, maybe Miss Elodie could explain more about the sashes around the trees. Then Jessie delivered Emmy her breakfast and left Daisy to pack the backpack with the day's supplies. 5 energy bars, a canteen of water, and a head of cabbage for Emmy. As soon as Emmy finished breakfast, they lit out with her and her dog form for Miss Elodie's house. They saw Miss Elodie's green beanie, which looked like the top of a zucchini bobbing along through the nose bushes. The roses seemed like their spiffy old selves, and the black-eyed Susans had their heads on straight. The garden, however, had wired fence surrounding it. On the way over, Daisy had already decided on the direct approach, so she stepped over the fence and marched around the roses right up to Miss Elodie, pointing a finger at the little woman. Daisy said, "We know you're magic." Miss Elodie's blue eyes danced and tucked her garden shears into one of her many pockets. "Well, now, what gave me away? Was it my glittering wand or my blue wizard's hat with silver stars on it?" Jessie didn't so much as crack a smile. "It was this fence right here," he said sternly. "Plus the cloth you wrapped around those trees," Daisy said. "You know the ones I'm talking about, the Douglas fir and the squawking aspen. Both the fence and the tree sashes are charms to ward off St. George's spell. So there's no use in denying it. And let's not forget, there's this superhumanly gorgeous garden of yours. How do I know you're not just a cracking good... I'm not just a cracking good gardener?" Miss Elodie asked, with a twinkle in her eyes. "Because you talk to the flowers," said Daisy. "And they probably talk back to you," added Jessie. Miss Elodie threw back her head and laughed until her blue eyes were bright with tears. "Well put, cousin," she said. "Would you care to come inside for a tisane and some fairy cake while we further discuss matters magical?" No way was Jessie ready for that. We're good." "We just had breakfast," Daisy said, "and we don't really have time." And then it all came tumbling out. At first, Daisy and Jessie told Miss Elodie everything. "I guess you can see why we need your help," Daisy said in conclusion. Miss Elodie cocked an eyebrow and regarded the children. She said after a pause, "But listen, you two. You are a far cry from helpless, not with this entire museum of magic at your disposal." Jessie and Daisy turned to look at each other, and they looked back at her. "Go on with you," she told them, shooting them back to the curb. "Check your inventory, and remember, no matter how bad things get, you have dragon magic on your side." Emmy barked in agreement. Jessie and Daisy were leaving Miss Elodie and called out, "Wait! I have something to give you, if you do one thing for me." They turned around, and in one hand Miss Elodie held out a ball of string. In the other hand was a jar full of fat, pink, wriggling earthworms. Daisy took the string and left the jar for Jessie. "Thanks, Miss Elodie," Jessie said dutifully. "What do you want us to do?" Miss Elodie's face went flat. "I want that book," she said in a low, urgent voice. "What book?" Daisy said blankly. "The big book," Jessie said. Jessie raised an eyebrow at Daisy. St. George's big book was just possibly the one detail they had left out of the story. "You mean the big book covered in red leather?" Daisy asked. "The one with an iron ring and the cover of funny gold writing all over it?" Miss Elodie nodded solemnly. "That very one. I want you to bring it back to me." Emmy barked enthusiastically. The cousins looked at her carefully, of course. Emmy wanted the book too. Hadn't she said so just the day before? Daisy laughed uneasily. "Okay, but How are we going to get it? It's too heavy for us to carry. When the moment is right, unscrew the lid of the jar and let the worms out, Miss Elodie said. Daisy shook her head slowly. Why? And what would be the right moment exactly? Jessie turned to Daisy so she could unzip the backpack and tuck away Miss Elodie's gifts. Miss Elodie was already back to work, down on her hands and knees pulling weeds. Oh, you'll know the right moment. How will we know? Jessie asked, resettling the weight on his back. Miss Elodie looked up at her, blue eyes dancing. You'll know, I'm sure of it. Two brave, resourceful dragon keepers, something will hit you. And incidentally, there are divas. What are divas? The cousins both asked. The spirits of the flowers, you say I talk to, said Miss Elodie with a wink. Call them divas. Checking their magical inventory was the first order of business, so Jessie, Emmy, and Daisy went directly to the barn for Miss Elodie's house. Even though they were pretty sure that St. George wouldn't be around during daylight hours, just to be on the safe side, they asked Emmy to wait until they were inside the barn to be transformed. Daisy slid the heavy barn door shut behind them. Jessie set down the backpack and Emmy turned into the dragon. Please come here, Emmy, said Daisy, going over to the Museum of Magic. You're the one with the dragon magic, so you try first. Is there anything here that looks useful, practical, in a magical kind of way? Emmy shuffled the display, which was arranged across some old boards on the top of the two sawhorses. I like this one, said Emmy, reaching out and taking her favorite item, the crusty old metal ball that was about the size of a peach, and cradling it in her paws. The Sorcerer's Sphere, Jessie said in an encouraging tone. I like it a lot, said Emmy brightfully. We know you like it, Daisy said patiently. You always have. But what we want to know is, how are we supposed to use it against St. George and his minions? Emmy shut her eyes and opened them quickly. She shook her head. Not now. I am sorry, Jessie and Daisy. I am not a very practical dragon. Jessie pressed her gently. You're 100% certain sure? Emmy nodded. Cross my heart and hope to die. Stick a beetle in my eye, she said. It's needle, Jessie corrected. Needle in your eye. Ouch, said Emmy, flinching. That would give me very bad boo-boo, wouldn't it? Yes, it would, said Daisy. So maybe you'd better not be sweating it. Okay? I'll guess it's my turn to try. While Jessie and Emmy looked on anxiously, Daisy closed her eyes and held her hands out over the magical collection. She waved them slowly over the rocks, feathers, skulls, horseshoes, and doorknobs, hoping to feel a tug in one direction or another. After what seemed like a very long time, she opened her eyes and shook her head. Guess I'm not very practical either. You try, Jess. She stood aside. Instead of closing his eyes and doing the same routine, Jessie simply drifted around the table, looking at the items as he went, giving each one full power of concentration. He had homed in on the green crystal doorknob when something bumped him so hard it knocked the breath out of him. Ouch, he said, rubbing his shoulder and looking around with a frown. Who did that? Daisy and Emmy both stared at him in amazement. Did you see that? Daisy asked. The shovel fell down on you. Crash, bang, boom, said Emmy, clapping her paws. It just fell off the wall where it was hanging and hit you, Daisy said. Nobody even touched it. Look. Jessie looked down at the old rusty shovel lying at his feet. He looked up at the wall where there were a bunch of old rusty farm implements hung. They had never paid much attention to these tools. Sometimes they thought the tools may be magic, but most of the time they just figured they were old and maybe a bit dangerous. Reaching down, Jesse picked up the shovel by its worn handle. He cried out as the shovel jerked down forward with a violence that nearly dislocated his arm. As if someone, a mighty strong someone, were yanking the shovel for all he or she was worth. "It's pulling me," he shouted to the others, feeding, scared and happy at the same time. "What do I do?" "Yikes," said Daisy, dancing nervously. "Hang on, I guess. See where it takes you." Jesse held onto the handle with both hands as the shovel powered him through the barn's sliding door. "Stay with me," he hollered over his shoulder. "Don't let it run away." "You are a very brave boy, Jesse Tiger," said Emmy. "Emmy Dragon loves you." "Daisy Flower does too," Daisy said breathlessly, "and we're right behind you, don't worry." They followed him outside, where a ramp ran up the side of the barn to a door that was boarded shut. They were not 10 feet from the barn. The earth rose in a gentle grassy hummock. The shovel blade rocketed skyward. For a brief, giddy moment, Jesse's feet dangled in midair. "Then the shovel is shooting me right into the sun," he thought. Then the blade came swooping back around and sank itself into the heart of the grassy hummock. After that, it proceeded to do what shovels do best: digging. "It's digging a hole," Daisy exclaimed in wonder, watching the shovel dig into the earth, scooped up dirt, and heave it to one side, dragging Jesse along with it like a rag doll. "I guess I better hang on," Jesse shouted. "It's stronger than I am." "Do what you can," Daisy called to him. Then Emmy said, "I will be a dog and dig with my puppy paws," transforming into her dog shape and beginning to dig enthusiastically alongside the team of Jesse and Shovel. The hole got deeper and the mound of dirt higher as both Jesse's shovel and Emmy's front paws burrowed their way into the earth. Jesse wanted to reach up and wipe off the sweat that was stinging his eyes, but he was afraid to let go. True to her word, Daisy stuck by him. She stood on the sidelines and watched, arm raised to protect herself from the flying earth, as she called out encouragement. For the last hour, the digging went on. It wasn't long before Jesse was so tired and dizzy he shut his eyes, and just as he was drifting off into a feverish swoon, the shovel flew up out of the hole and planted itself in the loose dirt. Jesse opened his eyes. He staggered out of the hole and sagged against the shovel. Daisy ran and brought him back a cup of icy cold water from the pump. Jesse pried off the lid with one hand on the shovel, took the cup, and drained it in one gulp. "Another," he gasped. Daisy got him another. He poured this one over his head, leaning on the handle of the shovel. He hadn't quite caught his breath yet, when his legs were weak and wobbly. "I know that the shovel did most of the work, but I don't think I've ever worked that hard in my whole life," he said to Daisy between shaky breaths. "You were great," Daisy said. "Emmy too. Look." Emmy lay on the barn ramp, too tired to turn back into a dragon, with her pink forked tongue hanging out of her mouth and her filthy furry side heaving. "Poor thing. I better get some fresh water for her too," taking the cup and returning to the pump. "Get one for my shovel while you're at it," Jesse called out to Daisy with a hoot of laughter. Gingerly, Jesse left the shovel in the dirt and looked at the palms of his hands. They were dotted with blisters. He blew on them. "Well, I think that's enough digging for one day," he said. As if it was in response, the shovel pulled itself out of the dirt, moved back down into the hole and continued to dig all by itself. The next minute, the shovel began to make scraping noises. I wish I'd known I could dig it. It would dig on its own, Jesse said as he peered in the hole. Is that wood? He asked. Daisy and Emmy, dragon formed once again, went to the edge of the hole and stared down into it. The shovel indeed uncovered something that looked very much like wood. The shovel stopped and stood aside, as if to give them all a chance to get a good look. It's old wood, Daisy said. Painted wood, said Jesse. The shovel went back to work, now only more slow and careful than before. It became obvious to the cousins and the dragon that the shovel was digging up a door, a plain wooden door, painted pale green. Soon the door was completely uncovered and surrounded on all four sides by a neat trench. It lay in the earth, an inviting rectangle set on a slight angle with the high end sloping upward toward the barn. And that's the end of chapter 4. Chapter 5 is called The Door in the Earth.